In the Uffizi Gallery hangs a painting that Leonardo da Vinci never finished. Abandoned in 1481 when he was just 29. For 5 centuries, it appeared as a murky, monochromatic composition barely visible through accumulated darkness. Then restoration revealed something shocking. The brown surface everyone assumed was Leonardo's intention was actually deliberate overpainting, applied by unknown hands 50 to 100 years after he left Florence. Beneath it lay a completely different work: brilliant charcoal lines, a lapis lazuli blue sky, and compositional choices so radical they shattered every convention of Renaissance religious painting. The most controversial question remains unanswered. Is the paint we see actually Leonardo's at all? We tell the stories of masterpieces hidden in plain sight and how time revealed their secrets. If that's your thing, subscribe. More of these are coming. Now let's get back to Leonardo. In room A35 of the Uffizi Gallery in Florence, commanding the central wall of what the museum calls its Leonardo room, hangs a painting that shouldn't exist. Not in the sense that it's been lost to history or destroyed by fire or war, but in the sense that for centuries no one could actually see what Leonardo da Vinci had painted. Stand before it now, and you're looking at something roughly 8 feet tall and equally wide, 244 by 240 centimeters, assembled from 10 vertical planks of poplar wood, a nearly perfect square. That format alone would have raised eyebrows in 1481 when altarpieces followed predictable rectangular proportions. But the format is the least surprising thing about this painting. What you see is a swirling mass of humanity arranged in a great semicircle. At the center sits the Virgin Mary, holding the infant Christ. Around them presses a crowd, not standing at respectful distance, not arranged in orderly procession, but surging inward like a wave breaking against rock. Approximately 66 human figures and 11 animals, all caught in a single moment of overwhelming recognition. The figures closest to the Christ child kneel in attitudes of desperate reverence. Some reach toward him with outstretched hands. Others recoil, shielding their eyes as if from blinding light. One elderly man covers his forehead with his hand as though physically struck. Another clasps his hands together in prayer, so intense it reads as agony. And the color, or rather, the lack of it. The entire composition exists in a world of browns and ambers, charcoal blacks and earth tones. No brilliant reds, no gold leaf catching the light, no rich blues of lapis lazuli in robes or drapery. Just this sepia-tone vision, like looking through centuries of accumulated varnish at something almost visible beneath, except that's not what you're seeing at all. Because this painting, officially titled Adorazione dei Magi, catalog number inventory 1890, number 1594, spent roughly 500 years hidden beneath layers of paint that weren't Leonardo's. For centuries, viewers saw only a murky monochromatic surface where figures were barely distinguishable from shadow. They assumed this was Leonardo's intention, a great master working in somber earth tones, creating a study in brown. Then, between 2011 and 2017, a restoration specialist at Florence's Opificio delle Pietre Dure stripped away that accumulated deception. What emerged was something art historian Marco Ciatti, who directed the 6-year restoration, described as incredibly bright. Sharp charcoal outlines suddenly visible, spatial depth legible for the first time in half a millennium. Individual faces, gestures, expressions, all of it emerging from obscurity. And in the sky above this turbulent human drama, a brilliant blue, lapis lazuli blue, applied over a lead-white base coat that had been invisible under centuries of deliberate overpainting. This is Leonardo da Vinci's Adoration of the Magi, painted in 1481 when the artist was 29 years old. He never finished it. He abandoned the commission within months and left Florence, leaving this panel as a work in progress that would remain frozen in its unfinished state for over 5 centuries. And yet, paradoxically, this unfinished painting tells us more about Leonardo's revolutionary vision than many of his completed masterpieces ever could. Look closer, because what appears at first glance to be a conventional religious scene, 3 wise men visiting the Christ child, is actually a record of a young genius in the act of shattering every rule of Renaissance painting. To understand why this painting is so radical, you need to understand who Leonardo was in 1481, and more importantly, who he wasn't yet. He wasn't the Leonardo we know from legend, not the supreme master of the High Renaissance, not the painter of the Mona Lisa or the Last Supper, and not the polymath whose notebooks would inspire centuries of artists and inventors. In 1481, Leonardo da Vinci was an ambitious but frustrated young artist struggling to establish himself in a city that hadn't fully recognized his genius. He was 29 years old, born illegitimate, the son of Ser Piero da Vinci, a prominent Florentine notary, and Caterina, a peasant woman, a birth circumstance that barred him from university education and his father's profession. That illegitimacy channeled his prodigious intellect entirely into art and engineering. He'd trained under Andrea del Verrocchio beginning around 1466, one of Florence's most respected masters, qualifying in the Guild of St. Luke by 1472. But he'd remained in Verrocchio's workshop as a collaborator until about 1477, well into his mid-20s. His early independent works showed extraordinary promise. The Annunciation in the Uffizi, the portrait of Ginevra de' Benci, now in Washington's National Gallery, the Benoit Madonna in the Hermitage, each demonstrated technical brilliance and psychological depth beyond his years. But promise doesn't pay for servants and horses. Leonardo was struggling financially. His notebooks from this period reveal a young man maintaining a workshop he couldn't quite afford, keeping servants, maintaining horses, all without steady income. In January 1478, he'd received his first major independent commission, an altarpiece for the chapel of St. Bernard in Florence's Palazzo della Signoria. He never completed it. The commission eventually passed to another artist, Filippino Lippi. Then came October 1480, and the ultimate professional snub. Lorenzo de' Medici, Il Magnifico himself, was dispatching Florence's finest painters to Rome to decorate the walls of the Sistine Chapel, a prestigious diplomatic gesture and artistic opportunity combined. Sandro Botticelli went, Domenico Ghirlandaio, Pietro Perugino, Cosimo Rosselli. Leonardo da Vinci was not invited. Think about what that meant. In a hierarchical artistic culture where commissions signaled status and papal recognition represented the pinnacle of achievement, Leonardo, acknowledged as technically brilliant, was left behind in Florence while his contemporaries worked in Rome. The omission suggests he remained somewhat marginal despite his obvious talent, perhaps too experimental, perhaps too unreliable, perhaps simply not yet proven. It was through his father's connections that opportunity finally arrived. With Ser Piero served as notary for the Augustinian monastery of San Donato a Scopeto, located just outside Florence's southern walls near the Porta Romana. In March 1481, the monks commissioned Leonardo to paint an altarpiece for their high altar. But here's what the contract actually offered. Instead of payment in florins, Leonardo would receive 1/3 of a small property in the Val d'Elsa, valued at 300 florins, but redeemable by the monks within 3 years. Worse, he was immediately obligated to pay 150 florins from this property as a dowry for the granddaughter of the property's original donor. 150 florins he didn't have. The monks advanced him small sums for colors, a load of firewood, 1 lira, and 6 sold for painting a clock. He was required to supply all other materials at his own expense. And then these were not the terms offered to a master at the height of his powers. These were terms accepted by an artist who needed work. So Leonardo da Vinci, illegitimate son, technically brilliant but professionally frustrated, excluded from the Sistine Chapel Commission, took on an altarpiece project with nearly impossible financial conditions. He was working simultaneously on another painting that would also remain unfinished, Saint Jerome in the Wilderness, now in the Vatican, rendered in the same incomplete monochrome state as the Adoration. The picture that emerges is of a young man wrestling with ideas too ambitious for the conventional frameworks available to him. An artist whose vision was running ahead of the structures meant to contain it. He worked intensely through 1481. Documentary evidence confirms he was actively painting in September. Preparatory drawings survive from this period, dozens of studies of horses, riders, architectural perspectives. One drawing in the Uffizi demonstrates two-point perspective construction that wouldn't come into common use until the 18th century. Scholar Christopher Tyler has called it apparently the earliest surviving analytic perspective drawing in the history of art. Leonardo was inventing techniques that wouldn't be standard practice for another 200 years. And then he stopped. By late 1481 or mid-1482, Leonardo left Florence for Milan. According to early biographers, Lorenzo de' Medici may have sent him as a cultural ambassador, presenting him to Duke Ludovico Sforza along with a silver lyre. Leonardo was an accomplished musician as well as painter. And Leonardo himself wrote a letter to Sforza offering his services. 10 numbered points, 9 devoted to military engineering, and only 1 to art. One of the earliest known professional resumes in history. Why did he abandon the painting? The financial terms were impossible. He still owed 150 florins he couldn't raise. Milan promised a stable court position with regular income. His professional frustration in Florence, crystallized by being left behind while his peers worked in Rome, pushed him toward fresh prospects. But there's another possibility. Art diagnostician Maurizio Serracini, who investigated the painting in 2002, has speculated that the monks may have rejected the unconventional composition outright. We don't know if that's true. What we do know is that Leonardo left this panel at the home of Amerigo de' Benci, a father of Ginevra, whose portrait Leonardo had painted in Florence's Santa Croce district. The monks waited over a decade before commissioning a replacement. Filippino Lippi completed his own Adoration of the Magi on March 29, 1496, nearly identical in dimensions to Leonardo's, suggesting he worked within the same altarpiece frame. Both paintings now hang in the Uffizi, enabling direct comparison. And the comparison is devastating. Lippi's version follows conventions, warm colors, elegant figures, portraits of Medici family members, decorative splendor. Everything the monks probably expected from Leonardo in the first place. Leonardo's abandoned panel, meanwhile, remained frozen at the moment a 29-year-old artist decided that conventional religious painting was no longer sufficient for what he was trying to express. To understand just how radical Leonardo's vision was, you need to grasp what Florence looked like in 1481, both physically and psychologically. Because this painting was conceived in the aftermath of violence that had nearly destroyed the Medici dynasty and plunged the city into war. April 26, 1478, Easter Sunday, the Florence Cathedral packed with worshippers for High Mass. Lorenzo de' Medici and his younger brother Giuliano stood near the altar when the attack came. Assassins struck during the consecration of the host, that most sacred moment when bread becomes body. Giuliano was stabbed 19 times and died on the cathedral floor. Lorenzo fought off his attackers and escaped, wounded, to the sacristy. The Pazzi conspiracy, backed by Pope Sixtus IV himself, coordinated by the rival Pazzi banking family, intended to replace Medici rule with papal authority. It failed. What followed was retribution on a scale Florence hadn't seen in generations. Approximately 80 people were executed between April and October 1478. Some hanged from the windows of the Palazzo della Signoria, their bodies left to rot as public warning. The Pazzi family was systematically erased from Florentine life, their coats of arms chiseled from buildings, their name forbidden, their properties confiscated. One of the conspirators, Archbishop Francesco Salviati, was hanged still wearing his episcopal vestments. Lorenzo had emerged more powerful than before, but the cost was war with the papacy and the Kingdom of Naples. Financial strain, diplomatic crisis, military threat. The conflict dragged on until Lorenzo made a desperate personal gambit in December 1479, in sailing to Naples to negotiate directly with King Ferrante, a man known for mummifying his enemies' bodies and keeping them in a castle gallery. Lorenzo returned in March 1480 with peace secured. In one of his first acts of cultural diplomacy, dispatching Florence's leading painters to Rome to decorate the Sistine Chapel walls, a reconciliation gesture to Pope Sixtus IV, and a demonstration of Florentine artistic supremacy. So when Leonardo received the Adoration Commission in March 1481, he was working in a Florence still processing trauma, a city that had seen assassination in its most sacred space, mass executions from palace windows, war with the Pope, and a peace bought through personal risk. A city where political power and religious authority were so intertwined that an attack on one was an attack on both. And the artistic environment? Largely depleted. Botticelli was in Rome. Ghirlandaio was in Rome. Perugino, Rosselli, all in Rome, painting the Sistine Chapel walls. The artists who remained in Florence were either those not selected for the Papal Commission, like Leonardo, or younger artists like Filippino Lippi still establishing themselves. Andrea del Verrocchio, Leonardo's former master, was there, but primarily focused on his great bronze equestrian monument. So Leonardo was working in a city defined by recent violence and current absence. A city where conventional forms of religious art, the reassuring pageantry of adoration paintings with their gold leaf and decorative processions, must have felt inadequate to the reality people had just lived through. The Augustinian monks of San Donato a Scopeto wanted an altarpiece showing the three magi visiting the Christ child. Standard iconography, predictable format. The kind of painting that had been commissioned in Florence for decades. But Leonardo was 29 years old, professionally frustrated, financially struggling, and apparently uninterested in repeating what had already been done. He was about to paint something that would make the monks' conventional expectations look quaint. Let's start with what the Adoration of the Magi was supposed to look like in 1481. The subject was among the most popular in Florentine art. The powerful Compagnia dei Magi confraternity, whose members included the Medici themselves, organized elaborate public pageants every few years, reenacting the Magi's journey through Florence's streets. Wealthy patrons commissioned adorations as vehicles for self-representation, embedding family portraits into biblical narrative. Gentile de Fabriano's magnificent 1423 altarpiece epitomized the tradition. Sumptuous fabrics rendered in gold leaf, crowded processions of elegantly dressed figures, the three kings in ornate robes, servants and animals creating decorative abundance. Benozzo Gozzoli's Medici chapel frescoes from 1459 to 1461 had updated the formula, depicting the Medici themselves riding through idealized Tuscan landscapes as if they were the Magi incarnate. The standard formula was clear. Horizontal, processional composition, the Virgin positioned to one side. The three Magi in rich costume, identifiable as wealthy patrons. Retinues of servants and attendants. Gold leaf catching candlelight. The reassuring presence of ox and donkey beside the manger. a stable or simple shelter, everything orderly, everything recognizable, everything reinforcing the social hierarchy of both biblical narrative and contemporary Florence. Even Botticelli's influential version from around 1475, now also in the Uffizi, had maintained decorative elegance while innovating the composition. Botticelli placed the Virgin centrally in a pyramidal arrangement, a shift toward more focused composition, but kept Medici family portraits embedded throughout, kept the rich colors, kept the sense of orderly ceremony. Now look at what Leonardo did. He placed the Virgin and Christ child at the center of a surging semicircle that presses inward like a human whirlpool. Not an orderly procession, but a crowd in the grip of collective revelation. Yes, 66 human figures and 11 animals, all reacting to a single moment of overwhelming recognition. No manger, no stable, no ox or donkey, no angels hovering above, no gold leaf, no rich fabrics that would let wealthy patrons see themselves reflected. Every standard element of nativity iconography stripped away. What Leonardo painted instead was a psychological study of humanity confronting the divine. The three magi aren't identifiable wealthy patrons posing in biblical costume. They're aged, physically vulnerable figures, overwhelmed by what they're witnessing. Look at the figure closest to the Christ child. On the right, one of the three kings, presumably. He's not presenting a gift with ceremonial dignity. He's kneeling in such intense devotion that his entire body seems to collapse toward the child. His hands are clasped, or his head bowed, his posture suggesting the kind of awe that borders on terror. And the surrounding crowd, this is where Leonardo's revolution becomes most visible. These figures aren't witnesses to a sacred event. They're experiencing an epiphany in real time. The precise moment when the infant Jesus reveals his divine nature. One figure reaches toward the child with both hands outstretched, fingers spread wide as if drawn by magnetic force. Another recoils, one hand raised as if shielding himself from unbearable light. A bearded man, later restoration would reveal an inscription beneath him identifying him as Giovanni, possibly Giovanni da Bologna, prior of the Scopeto convent, covers his forehead with his hand as though physically struck by divine radiance. Look at the range of reactions Leonardo captured. Desperate prayer, ecstatic recognition, physical recoil, hands covering eyes, arms raised in supplication. Each figure responding with unfiltered human emotion to an event that shatters ordinary experience. This is what scholars mean when they describe the painting as depicting the precise moment of epiphany, not the arrival of the Magi, but the instant of divine revelation, the instant when ordinary perception gives way to something overwhelming and transformative. And Leonardo rendered it all in monochrome, no distracting color, no decorative elements pulling attention away from psychological intensity, just earth tones, umber, charcoal, forcing viewers to focus entirely on gesture, expression, spatial relationship. Except that monochrome appearance was partly an accident of history. Because remember, the restoration revealed that brilliant lapis lazuli blue sky above the scene. Leonardo had applied expensive blue pigment over a lead-white base coat. For centuries, that sky was invisible under later overpainting. We don't know what other colors Leonardo intended. The painting was abandoned before he could develop its color palette. But we know he wasn't planning simple monochrome. What we're seeing is something caught between Leonardo's initial vision and its unrealized potential. The compositional structure is there. The psychological intensity is there. The revolutionary departure from convention is there, but frozen before completion so we can see exactly how Leonardo worked. And that process, revealed by the restoration, was unlike anything his contemporaries did. Most Renaissance painters worked systematically. They prepared full-scale cartoons, Complete drawings transferred to the panel and worked across the surface uniformly, developing all areas to similar stages of finish before proceeding. It was organized, methodical, professional. Leonardo drew and painted directly on the panel. No cartoon transfer, no systematic progression. Marco Ciatti, who spent 6 years with the painting during restoration, described how Leonardo distributed different levels of completion across the surface, like spots on a leopard skin. Some areas barely sketched, others substantially modeled. The Virgin and Child relatively developed. Background figures mere suggestions in charcoal. Cecilia Frosinini, who worked on the restoration team, called it the most quintessential work in progress in the history of art. She noted, "It is as if we are privy to a private conversation, Leonardo talking to himself, perhaps even arguing with himself, because Leonardo was inventing his process as he went, working out problems of composition, expression, and spatial organization directly on the panel surface. The infrared analysis revealed something extraordinary. Leonardo drew freehand, improvising. 4 horse heads along the right edge in different positions, evidence of him trying different solutions to the same compositional problem. He didn't plan everything in advance and execute. He explored, revised, reconsidered. Now look at the background. On the left side of the composition, ruined classical architecture rises above the human drama, a double staircase leading up to fragmentary walls and arches. On the right, horsemen clash in fierce combat. Neither of these elements was standard in adoration iconography. Neither appears in the conventional formula, so why are they here? The ruined architecture has been interpreted as the legendary Basilica of Maxentius, which Romans claimed would stand until a virgin gave birth. Its ruined state would thus represent the fulfillment of prophecy, the old order giving way to the new. Workers are visible on the staircase, apparently engaged in reconstruction. Antonio Natali, former director of the Uffizi, connected this specifically to Isaiah's prophecies about the rebuilding of the temple and the peace brought by the Savior, Isaiah 60:10 and Isaiah 60:13. And texts the Augustinian monks would have specified in their theological program for the painting. The battling horsemen are even more radical. Combat scenes simply didn't appear in adoration paintings. This was supposed to be about peace, peace on earth, as the angels proclaimed at Christ's birth. So why is Leonardo painting warfare? Multiple interpretations exist. Some scholars see it as representing the wars that preceded Christ's coming, the violent pagan world about to be superseded by Christian peace. Others read it as depicting those who reject Christianity, caught in perpetual conflict. Still others see it as Leonardo beginning to work out ideas that would culminate in his lost masterpiece, the Battle of Anghiari, painted decades later. The infrared analysis Maurizio Saracini conducted in 2002 revealed even more. Beneath the surface, he found rampaging horses engaged in fierce combat that's been obscured by later paint. A small elephant in the upper right area. Faces and figures invisible to the naked eye. A perspective grid covering the entire panel, with a nail at the vanishing point Leonardo had used with strings to draw perspective lines. A watercourse or chasm beneath the rock on which the Virgin sits, the kind of geological formation that would appear years later in the Virgin of the Rocks, all of it prefiguring what Leonardo would do in his mature work. The psychological intensity of the Last Supper, the geological mysteries of the Virgin of the Rocks, the battle scenes of Anghiari, the atmospheric perspective, the sfumato, the chiaroscuro. It's all here in embryonic form, frozen in 1481 by a 29-year-old artist who took a commission for a conventional altarpiece and instead painted a revolution. But we haven't yet examined the most mysterious elements. The trees at the center of the composition, the young man at the far right who might be Leonardo himself, the deeper symbolic program encoded in details most viewers never notice. And we haven't confronted the most controversial question of all: how much of what we're seeing is actually Leonardo's work, and how much was painted by unknown hands decades after he abandoned the panel. Two trees rise from the center of the composition, directly behind the Virgin Mary. They're easy to miss amid the swirling humanity, but their placement is deliberate, emerging from the precise compositional center, framing the Virgin and Child from behind. On the left, a palm tree. In Christian iconography, the palm carried multiple meanings: symbol of the Virgin Mary herself, symbol of martyrdom, symbol of victory over death. Its presence here would have been immediately legible to Leonardo's contemporaries. Nothing surprising, nothing revolutionary. But look at the tree on the right. Taller, more substantial, its canopy spreading above the scene. Art historians have struggled to identify it definitively. Some call it a carob, others a laurel. Still others identify it as the tree of Jesse, the genealogical tree from which the Messiah descends according to medieval Christian tradition. What matters isn't botanical accuracy. What matters is position, because Leonardo's perspective grid, that network of lines radiating from a single vanishing point that structures the entire composition, doesn't place its vanishing point at random. It falls at the golden ratio of the panel's length, near this central tree. The golden ratio, that mathematical proportion approximately 1.618 to 1 that appears throughout nature, and that Renaissance theorists believed represented divine perfection. Leonardo positioned the organizing principle of his entire perspective system at a point marked by the genealogical tree of Christ. This is the level of sophistication Leonardo was working at. Not just arranging figures pleasingly, but encoding mathematical and theological meaning into the fundamental structure of the composition. Now look at the far right edge of the painting. A young man stands facing outward, his body angled toward us rather than toward the central scene. His right hand gestures back toward the Virgin and Child, as if drawing our attention, inviting us into the revelation he's witnessing. His face, what we can see of it through centuries of damage and incomplete execution, looks directly out at us. Multiple scholars following a tradition noted by critic Angelo Partico identify this figure as Leonardo's self-portrait at age 30. The convention was established. Botticelli had included himself in his own Uffizi adoration. Filippino Lippi would do the same in his replacement painting. Artists embedded themselves in their works as both signature and witness. If this is Leonardo, consider what it means. He's not kneeling with the faithful. He's not lost in the crowd experiencing epiphany. He stands at the edge gesturing toward the scene, positioned between the sacred event and us. The role of intermediary, the guide. The one who sees and shows others how to see. It's the exact role Leonardo was claiming for himself as an artist, not merely recording sacred events, but revealing their deeper significance. Not decorating churches, but investigating the nature of human response to the divine. At the far left, another standing figure has been identified by Antonio Natali as the prophet Isaiah. If Natali's interpretation is correct, and the figure's position and gesture support it, then Leonardo was framing his entire composition between Old Testament prophecy and contemporary witness. Isaiah, who foretold the virgin birth and the coming of peace. Leonardo himself observing it unfold. The entire symbolic program becomes visible. Ruined classical architecture representing the pagan world giving way. Workers reconstructing according to Isaiah's prophecy. Our combat representing pre-Christian violence. The genealogical tree marking the vanishing point. The palm of martyrdom. The prophet and the artist as bookends. And at the center, the moment of epiphany itself, humanity confronting divinity, captured with psychological precision that no one had achieved before. But here's where the painting's controversy deepens into genuine mystery, because for centuries almost none of this was visible. The painting appeared as a uniform dark brown composition. Figures were barely distinguishable. Details were lost in murk. And everyone, scholars, curators, the public assumed this was Leonardo's intention. Then came the investigations. Maurizio Saraceni, an engineering physicist who founded Florence's first cultural diagnostics firm in 1977, was commissioned by the Uffizi in 2002 to assess whether the painting could be safely restored. Using infrared reflectography, thermographic imaging, ultrasound, and ultraviolet fluorescence, his team produced more than 2,400 detailed infrared photographic records of what lay beneath the surface. What they found challenged everything scholars thought they knew about the painting. The elaborate underdrawing Saraceni revealed showed a completely different visual world. Those battling horsemen in the background, far more extensive than what appeared on the surface, a full battle scene that had been obscured. The small elephant that doesn't appear in the visible painting. Faces and figures invisible to the naked eye. The perspective grid covering the entire panel. A watercourse or chasm beneath the Virgin's rock. But the most explosive finding was this. The painting's surface had been covered with a deliberate layer of pigmented varnish, what restorers call patination, designed to make the entire picture appear as a monochrome work. This wasn't accumulated dirt and age, this was intentional overpainting, and chemical analysis suggested this overpainting had been applied 50 to 100 years after Leonardo abandoned the work, roughly 1530 to 1580, by unknown artist or artists. Saraceni disclosed his findings to the New York Times in 2002, then to The Guardian in 2005. His most provocative claim appeared in the 2006 exhibition catalog, The Mind of Leonardo. None of the paint we see on the Adoration today was put there by Leonardo. None of it. If true, what we've been examining for centuries isn't Leonardo's painting at all. It's someone else's interpretation of Leonardo's underdrawing, applied decades after his death when his fame had grown, and an unfinished panel by the legendary Leonardo da Vinci had become valuable enough to warrant completion by unknown hands. Martin Kemp, Oxford's leading Leonardo scholar, examined Saraceni's findings and published his assessment in Nature in 2002. He confirmed that infrared reflectography revealed more of the subtle beauties of Leonardo's touch than is visible on the discolored surface. Cross-section showed Leonardo had laid a semi-translucent layer of white lead over his delicate underdrawing, and that the heavier brownish layer had seeped into cracks in the lower strata, implying that it was added much later. The painting had been fundamentally altered by unknown hands. Saraceni concluded the painting could not be safely restored without damage. The Uffizi shelved his findings. The controversy simmered, and in an odd twist of cultural history, Saraceni became the only real person mentioned in Dan Brown's The Da Vinci Code, his investigation directly inspiring the novel's plot about hidden layers in Leonardo's work. Finally, in November 2011, the Opificio delle Pietre Dure, Florence's premier restoration institute, began a full restoration that would last until March 2017, 6 years. Directed by Marco Ciatti and Cecilia Frossanini, cleaning by Roberto Bellucci and Patrizia Ritano, wooden support restoration by Cairo Castelli and Andrea Santacesaria, funded by the Amici degli Uffizi and the Getty Foundation. They deployed cutting-edge technology, Fourier transform infrared spectrometry, X-ray fluorescence, our optical coherence tomography, 3D optical scanning at 0.3 millimeter resolution, and they directly challenged Saraceni's conclusion. Roberto Bellucci stated, "Of course there were restorations and small additions here and there over the centuries, but we are convinced that this is all substantially Leonardo." Two teams of experts, Same painting. Opposite conclusions about whether the paint we see is Leonardo's or not. This disagreement remains one of the central scholarly controversies surrounding the work, and it can't be definitively resolved because Leonardo never finished the painting. We don't know what it was supposed to look like. We can't compare the existing surface to completed areas and say definitively, this matches or this doesn't. What we do know is what the restoration revealed when they removed the later varnish and patination. The painting became incredibly bright. Charcoal outlines emerged with startling clarity. That lapis lazuli blue sky appeared, expensive pigment applied over lead-white base coat, invisible for centuries. Spatial depth became suddenly legible. Individual figures and their gestures distinguishable for the first time in half a millennium. Different stages of completion clearly readable across the panel surface. An inscription was discovered beneath the bearded figure covering his forehead, identifying him as Giovanni, possibly the prior of the Scopeto convent, embedded within the painting that was meant for his monastery's altar. X-ray analysis revealed additional mysteries. A draft composition resembling the later Virgin of the Rocks in the bottom portion of the panel, Leonardo working out ideas that would appear in paintings he'd create years later in Milan, and his pioneering use of vegetal fibers, tow, to reinforce the joints between the 10 poplar planks, a technique that wouldn't become common practice for another century. The physical panel itself had suffered dramatically. A band of approximately 10 centimeters had been cut from the bottom at some unknown date. Sections of wood at the top had been removed and reinserted with large nails. The back showed water damage. Woodworms, flies, and larvae had infested the panel. The 10 planks had progressively separated almost to the painted surface, threatening structural collapse. The original 16th century gilt frame had been lost during a transfer to the Villa di Castello in 1681. What returned to the Uffizi's central wall in 2017 was something that looked simultaneously more complete and more fragmentary than what had hung there before. More complete because we could finally see Leonardo's compositional structure, his charcoal work, his modeling technique. More fragmentary because the restoration made clear just how unfinished the painting actually is. Areas that centuries of patination had unified into uniform darkness, now revealed as radically different stages of execution. So what is this painting ultimately saying? What was Leonardo trying to express that conventional adoration iconography couldn't contain? The answer lies in that central crowd, those 66 figures pressing inward toward the Christ child with such psychological intensity. Because Leonardo wasn't painting the arrival of the Magi. He was painting something far more universal and far more challenging. He was painting the precise moment when human beings encounter something that shatters their understanding of reality. Look again at those faces. The range of responses: ecstasy, terror, devotion, disbelief, physical recoil, desperate reaching. Some figures embrace the revelation, others literally shield themselves from it. One elderly magus collapses in worship. Another man covers his forehead as if struck by unbearable light. This is what Epiphany actually means. Not a pleasant recognition, but a fundamental rupture in ordinary perception. The moment when the veil tears and what's behind it overwhelms human capacity to process it. Leonardo was doing something unprecedented in religious art. He was painting the psychological reality of divine encounter rather than its ceremonial representation, not how the church wanted people to respond to Christ's presence, not how wealthy patrons wanted to be shown responding, but how human beings actually would respond with the full, messy, contradictory range of human emotion. Some embrace transformation, some resist it.
Some are physically incapable of facing it directly. All are changed. The stripped-away conventional elements now make sense. No gold leaf, because this isn't about decoration. No manger and stable, because this isn't about comfortable nativity narrative. No orderly procession, because this isn't about social hierarchy. Everything that would distance viewers from the raw psychological reality of the moment removed. What remains is humanity confronting divinity without mediation, without ceremony, without the protective conventions that make sacred encounters feel safe and manageable. And the background elements reinforce this theme. The ruined classical architecture, the old order giving way, whether pagan Rome or Old Testament Judaism. The workers reconstructing according to Isaiah's prophecy, actively building the new order even as the revelation unfolds. The battling horsemen, violence and chaos being superseded by the peace this child represents, but still raging in the background because transformation isn't instantaneous or easy. The two trees at the center, one marking the Virgin's martyrdom and victory, and the other marking Christ's genealogy and the vanishing point of perspective itself. As if Leonardo was saying, this moment is where all lines converge. All history leads here. All perspective organizes around this encounter. If the young man at the far right is indeed Leonardo's self-portrait, his position takes on additional meaning. He's witnessed the revelation. He's gesturing us toward it. But he stands outside the crowd at the edge facing outward. The artist's position, observing, understanding, translating experience into form that others can access. Leonardo was 29 years old when he painted this. Professionally frustrated, financially struggling, excluded from the Sistine Chapel Commission, working under nearly impossible contract terms. And he was using this commission to make an argument about what religious art could be. Not decoration for wealthy chapels, not vehicles for patron self-representation, not reassuring repetitions of familiar iconography, but instruments for revealing psychological and spiritual truth. The Augustinian monks commissioned a conventional altarpiece for their high altar. Leonardo gave them a meditation on the nature of transformation itself, how human beings respond when confronted with something that exceeds their capacity to comprehend it. No wonder he abandoned it, because to finish this painting would have meant compromising, adding the conventional elements that would make it acceptable, softening the psychological intensity, making it more decorative, more reassuring, more appropriate for a monastery altar, or it would have meant pushing even further into radical territory, developing the colors, completing the modeling, clarifying the battle scene, an elephant, and all the other elements visible in infrared, creating something even more shocking than what exists in this unfinished state. Giorgio Vasari, writing in 1568, blamed Leonardo's chronic non-completion on perfectionism. His hand could not achieve the perfection of the things he imagined. That's partly true. Leonardo's vision consistently outpaced his technical means, even when those means were extraordinary. But there's another possibility the restoration revealed. Marco Ciatti, who spent 6 years studying every millimeter of the panel's surface, offered this assessment. It is especially difficult to pinpoint the reasons for this artistic choice. Artistic choice, not failure. Not abandonment due to circumstances. Choice. What if Leonardo recognized that this painting, in its unfinished state, accomplished something that no completed version could? That this record of a mind in the act of revolution, frozen mid-thought, communicating directly with 5 centuries of viewers without the mediation of conventional finish. What if this was more powerful than any resolved painting could be? Cecilia Frossenini called it the most quintessential work in progress in the history of art and noted, "It is as if we are privy to a private conversation." Leonardo talking to himself,
perhaps even arguing with himself. That's exactly what we're seeing. A genius in dialogue with his own vision, working out problems of representation that had never been solved before, inventing techniques that wouldn't be standard for centuries. All captured at the moment of creation. The unfinished state reveals Leonardo's process in ways completed paintings never could. We see him improvising, those four horse heads along the right edge in different positions, evidence of trying different solutions. We see him distributing completion like spots on a leopard's skin rather than working systematically. We see him drawing and painting directly on the panel rather than transferring from cartoons. We see the revolution happening in real time. The unfinished panel remained at Amerigo da Vinci's house in Florence's Santa Croce district, where Vasari saw it decades later. The Augustinian monks waited until around 1494 before commissioning Filippino Lippi to paint a replacement. Lippi's version, completed in 1496, followed conventional expectations: warm colors, elegant figures,
Medici portraits, decorative splendor. Both paintings now hang in the Uffizi. The comparison between them is instructive. Lippi was a talented, accomplished painter. His adoration is beautiful, well executed, appropriate. And it looks utterly conventional next to Leonardo's abandoned panel, even in its degraded, overpainted state before restoration. Leonardo's panel entered the Medici collections by 1601 through Don Antonio de' Medici, formally joined the Florentine galleries in 1670, transferred to the Via di Castello in 1681, losing its original frame in the process, returned permanently to the Uffizi in 1794. For centuries, it hung as a curiosity, the great Leonardo's unfinished early work, interesting primarily as a biographical document showing what he was working on before he left for Milan.
The uniform dark brown appearance made detailed study difficult. Figures were barely distinguishable. The revolutionary nature of the composition was visible but muted, as if seen through fog. Then came the investigations. Saraceni's infrared analysis in 2002 revealed the hidden complexity. The scholarly debate about authenticity erupted. Dan Brown's The Da Vinci Code made the painting a cultural touchstone. And finally, the 2011 to 2017, restoration transformed it from curiosity to revelation. What emerged was a painting that scholars now recognize as marking, in Ciotti's words, a full-blown revolution on the artistic scene in the Florence of its day. Because everything Leonardo would do in his mature career appears here in embryonic form. The battling horsemen anticipate the lost battle of Anghiari. The geological chasm beneath the Virgin foreshadows the Virgin of the Rocks. The semicircular arrangement of psychologically intense figures around a central sacred presence prefigures the Last Supper's composition and emotional dynamics. The sfumato, that soft atmospheric haziness Leonardo would perfect. The chiaroscuro, dramatic light and shadow modeling form. The atmospheric perspective, depth created through subtle gradations rather than sharp linear recession. Kenneth Clark's landmark 1939 monograph on Leonardo elevated the adoration as pivotal documentation of his transition from conventional Florentine workshop practice to radical independence. Martin Kemp situated it as a critical junction in Leonardo's development. Carlo Pedretti provided foundational chronological context. Jack Wasserman contributed detailed formal analysis.
Carmen C. Bombach examined the preparatory drawings extensively in her 4-volume Leonardo da Vinci rediscovered in 2019. The painting has shaped how scholars understand Leonardo's creative process, that direct improvisational approach, working without cartoons, distributing completion non-systematically. It's become the exemplary case of Leonardo's inability or unwillingness to finish what he started, but also evidence that his unfinished works sometimes reveal more than his completed ones. And for contemporary viewers, the restored painting offers something unique. Most Leonardo paintings exist in heavily restored states, with centuries of overpainting and conservation work obscuring original surfaces. The Mona Lisa sits behind bulletproof glass in the Louvre, so small and so mobbed by tourists that careful observation is nearly impossible. The Last Supper in Milan is a heavily damaged fresco, its surface compromised by Leonardo's experimental technique and centuries of deterioration. But the Adoration, precisely because it was abandoned and then buried under patination, preserves Leonardo's charcoal, underdrawing with remarkable clarity. After restoration, we can see his hand moving across the surface. We can observe his decision-making process. We can watch him invent solutions to problems he himself created by refusing conventional approaches. It's the closest we can get to standing in Leonardo's workshop in 1481, watching a 29-year-old genius in the act of revolution. Stand before it now in the Uffizzi's Leonardo room, commanding the central wall of Sala A35.
That nearly square format, 8 feet tall, assembled from 10 planks of poplar wood that have separated and been reconstructed and bear the scars of 5 centuries. The swirling semicircle of humanity pressing inward toward the Virgin and Child. The psychological intensity captured in gesture and expression, reaching, recoiling, shielding, praying. The stripped away conventional elements that would have made this comfortable. The blue sky that was invisible for centuries. The ruined architecture and battling horsemen framing scenes of transformation. And all of it frozen in a state between vision and execution, between intention and completion, between revolution and resolution. 536 years have passed since Leonardo abandoned this panel and left Florence for Milan. In that time, unknown hands painted over it, attempting to make the unfinished presentable. Restorers applied layers of varnish and glue. The wooden support degraded and separated. The painting lost its frame, was moved between locations, entered the Medici collections, became public property, hung for centuries as a curiosity barely visible through accumulated darkness. Then diagnostic technology revealed what was hidden. Restoration revealed what Leonardo had actually painted, and we discovered that what seemed like an interesting but minor early work was actually a record of the moment when one of history's greatest artists decided that everything that came before was insufficient. The Adoration of the Magi is not just an unfinished painting. It's the embryo of everything Leonardo became. The psychological intensity of the Last Supper.
The geological mysteries of the Virgin of the Rocks, the battle dynamics of Anghiari, the atmospheric effects of the Mona Lisa, all of it present here in 1481, when a 29-year-old artist took a commission from monks expecting conventional piety and gave them instead a meditation on the violence and wonder of transformation itself. The monks got their conventional replacement from Filippino Lippi 15 years later. Both paintings hang in the Uffizi now. You can compare them directly, convention beside revolution, completion beside abandonment, the comfortable beside the challenging. Leonardo never saw his Adoration again after he left Florence. Never knew it would enter the Medici collections, hang in the Uffizi, be buried under overpainting, be revealed by restoration, become the subject of scholarly debate and diagnostic investigation and popular fascination. He left it unfinished, whether because the financial terms were impossible, because Milan offered better prospects, because the monks rejected his vision, or because he recognized that some visions exceed the means available to execute them. We can't know for certain. What we know is what remains. This turbulent, brilliant, frustrating, revelatory panel that refuses to be anything other than what it is. A genius arguing with himself, inventing techniques centuries ahead of their time, demanding that religious art be more than decoration, capturing the psychological reality of divine encounter without the protective distance of convention, frozen mid-revolution, preserved by accident. And finally, after 5 centuries of obscurity, made visible again